you just go to Committee on Rural Food Security, and then you'll see HLPE under that, which stands for High Level Panel of Experts, which is the group that makes these reports. Or you could just Google HLPE Agroecology for this report. Social movements, I mentioned, had been pushing to have this report written for years because they see agroecology as being so important and such a hopeful food production system. The fight by social movements was necessary mainly because the U.S. government tried to derail this process at every stage. A group of non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations, delivered a letter to the U.S. ambassador to the Food and Agriculture Organization Tuesday before last, and I was there when he got it, that denounced U.S. obstructionism against agroecology. He was standing there and he said, "What do you mean obstructionism?" Yes, obstructionism. Yet, even though he'd gotten that letter in the plenary session when in front of all the delegates from all the countries and people from social movements and people from international scientific organizations, the private sector, he said that biotechnology is the answer to feeding the world and must be promoted at all costs. So that's what the United States is behind. And it's a ridiculous view. Biotechnology does not feed the world. If you open up a farm magazine, you'll see a lot of advertisements from companies like Monsanto that say, "Relax, we've got everything under control. We are all about sustainability," but don't believe them. Millions of small-scale farmers, many of them farming plots of land that are too small to sustain their families, are providing between 70 and 80% of the world's food without biotechnology. So biotechnology does not help to feed the world. Almost all of the development of biotechnology has been by private corporations, such as Monsanto, which has now merged with Bayer, a German company. I'm sure Bayer is a little bit unhappy because all the suits against Monsanto for lymphoma and other forms of cancer that were caused by repeated exposure to Roundup, glyphosate, this product that was their key pesticide, those have been emerging since this merger. But almost all of the development of biotechnology has been to create corn and soy that's resistant to Roundup, resistant to glyphosate. So the company is able to sell farmers the seed and the pesticide in one nice little package, all wrapped up with a bow. Just 4 GMO crops account for almost all, more than 99% of GMO agriculture hectares. The big four, these 4 genetically modified crops, are soy, that's 50%, corn, 31%, cotton, 13%, and canola. Most of the canola oil you buy in a supermarket will be genetically modified, by the way, unless you buy organic. If you buy organic, you know it's not genetically modified, if that's important to you. Most of the world's genetically modified crops are herbicide tolerant, and the U.S. is the country with the most GMO acreage, accounting for 40% of the global total. Now, let me say something that might sound counterintuitive. I think genetic modification has potential to be used for the good. I'm not inherently opposed to genetic modification. It's a way of tinkering with seeds, and I think there are all kinds of things that have gone wrong and can go wrong. So it needs to be done very, very carefully. And any releases into the environment should be done after extremely careful scrutiny. But it's possible for it to be done for the public good. The biggest problem with genetic modification is that it's been a major way that these huge pesticide and seed corporations have consolidated their power and consolidated their power over farmers. You hear about farmer suicides in India. That's because they were sold these genetically modified crops that didn't perform the way they were supposed to perform, and then the farmers went into debt, and a lot of them felt so ashamed at being in debt and not being able to support their families that they commit suicide, often tragically by drinking the pesticides that they've been sold. So that has been a huge problem. U.S. representatives to the Committee on Rural Food Security see agroecology as threatening their corporate friends. And in our country, the Department of Agriculture and corporations are just hand in glove. The corporations won't be able to sell nearly as much pesticides and genetically modified seeds if agroecology becomes the norm. So that's why the United States has fought against it so hard. Yet agroecology is really the only possibility. Industrialized agriculture is a dead end. It's killing and eroding soil, it's killing pollinators and birds, it's emitting greenhouse gases, it's contaminating water, and hurting livestock in industrialized, confined animal feeding operations. The U.S. is stuck in a rut, and the sooner we can get out of that rut, the better off we'll be. We're supporting a farming system that is lethal. And U.S. policies about farming systems do make a difference. Here's that same slide I showed you earlier about this Agroecology report that came out. And interestingly, the United States was pretty much isolated. All other countries came out except for Australia and Canada, who tend to stand with the United States. All the other countries came out very much in favor of agroecology. The United States had insisted that if there's going to be a report about agroecology, they wanted it to include other innovative approaches like biotechnology. So that's in here, but if you read the report, it's pretty obvious that agroecology has the most different benefits to farmer incomes, to healthy food, to healthy environment, to farm workers who don't end up getting sprayed by pesticides. But the point I want to make is that U.S. policies and the way the U.S. representative who was speaking for USDA was standing up at the Committee on Rural Food Security make a huge difference. Here's one of those diagrams, and you can hardly even tell what these things are because they're so bloated. But the size of each country is proportional to the amount of genetically modified organisms, the amount to which they have adopted genetically modified crops. And as you can see, this is the United States, and the reason South America is so big is that Brazil is second. 26% is accounted for by Brazil and Argentina, and then Canada at 7%. So we are the big four that are propping up this genetic engineering industry. And there's a flip side to that. Just as we are propping up industrial agriculture along with genetic modification, we are failing to support organic agriculture, which is one of the most well-known forms of agroecology. There's the only form that's actually certified, to my knowledge. But, well, there are different certification systems for this kind of bio-intensive agriculture that's used in Europe. But this is showing how countries have adopted organic agriculture. And as you can see, here's the United States. We have failed to adopt agroecology, failed to adopt organic agriculture in proportion to the extent to which we have endorsed and adopted industrial agriculture as exemplified by our adoption of genetic modification. So let me say just a little bit of what agroecology is, and then I'm going to turn it over to John, who will show you what it is, because that's what he does. He may not use the term agroecology, but I would use it for what he's doing. If you don't use that term when you talk to people about your farming system, John, my guess is that it's because most people in this country have never heard of agroecology and would have no idea what he's saying when he says that. But these are the principles from this report of agroecology. First, recycling, that you use local resources right there on your farm and you close the loops. You put nutrients that have been composted or treated in some way so that any pathogens are gone from them, or biomass like mulch, you put them back on the farm so that you are not wasting anything on the farm. You reduce or eliminate your dependency on purchased inputs and increase your self-sufficiency. So this is exactly why the United States government is against agroecology. Soil health, you're doing everything possible to secure and enhance soil health for improved plant growth. I took a group of students up to John's farm and he was showing them what he's doing, and the students in the way they do were trying to get really close to John so they could hear what he was saying, and John said, no, don't step on the beds. You'll compact the soil. He had very carefully mulched this soil, and if you stick your hand down into it, it's amazing. The tilth of that soil is so loose, so friable, the term that agronomists like to use for soil that can be very easily worked. Animal health, another principle. Biodiversity. Agroecology is all about enhancing biodiversity of all forms, but biodiversity is right at the center of that, trying to make sure that agrobiodiversity, the diversity of varieties and crops and livestock species, are great, but also that you are enhancing the biodiversity around your farm by planting, for instance, pollinators, pollinator species, the pollinators who would be visiting your area can come to visit. They're attracted to these species, and it helps to keep them alive. Most farmers using agroecology are also setting aside some natural areas on their farms to enhance habitat for wild biodiversity. Synergy, trying to make the whole farm work together better. And there are interesting ways that can be done. John will probably explain some of the things that he's doing. Economic diversification, not only biodiversification, but also economic diversification. Farmers grow multiple crops or raise crops and livestock, so if one thing fails, they can rely on another thing. So this is such a better alternative to the monocultures of corn and soy with occasional pigs that we see over so much of the United States, where if there's a big flood, well, I'm not sure if anything would have survived those floods in Iowa, but if there's a big flood, they are just wiped out. A few more principles. Co-creation of knowledge, and this is really my last slide. I'm not going to keep going through slides of principles. But farmers who are practicing agroecology learn from other farmers, and they tend to share their knowledge. It's one of the things I've appreciated so much about John, that he has such a commitment to sharing his knowledge, to teaching other people, not just students, but working with other farmers as well. Social values and diets, because agroecological farmers are raising a diversity of species, they can better provide a diversity of foods, which are the core of a healthy diet, eating a lot of different kinds of food, and of course avoiding ultra-processed food and eating plenty of fruits and vegetables and avoiding too much salt and sugar. But basically, you need diverse diets in order to be healthy. Fairness, supporting dignified and robust livelihoods for all of the workers, in the food system, connectivity, land and natural resource governance, where the people who are actually there, whose livelihoods depend on farming, are the ones who are able to make decisions about land and water. They aren't decisions that are made by some entity a long way away and imposed on the farmers. There's a lot more local governance. And finally, participation, encouraging social organization and greater participation in decision-making by everyone, including consumers. So all of us have a stake in the food system, and all of us should be able to say something and to help make decisions about the kind of food system that we have. So that's my introduction to agroecology, and now I'm going to turn things over to John to show you what he's actually doing. Let me get out of this.
While you're getting out of
Sure.
that, one of the things I often talk about is that that we vote with our pocketbooks. So there's a simple way that we can affect change is by choosing what foods we buy.
You're right, you're right. And buying food at a place like the co-op, where the benefits are shared, they go back to the community. The co-op has an empty plate dinner coming up in just about a week, which is one of the ways that they provide for food insecure people in our community. All the benefits from the empty plate dinner are shared between Hope and CVOEO, our two food pantries. And also it's fun. You get this beautiful bowl that's been donated, and you get a nice dinner, and the co-op board all gets together and serves the food. So buying from the co-op or buying from local producers are ways to support them. But also, when you say that, Rua, Michael Pollan came out with this slogan, vote with your fork. And I kind of resist that, because voting with your fork is not enough. You also have to be supporting legislators who share your values and who are fighting for farmers and a clean environment. So do both. Vote with your fork and also vote with your vote. So John. And I'm going to sneak my water in case I get a coughing fit again.
If I close this down, it will be okay?
I wouldn't do that.
Just a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all, Betsy, for putting this all together. Thank you, Molly, for encouraging me to be a part of it. I didn't grow up on a farm. So I grew up in northern Connecticut and around a lot of farms, but farming was not a part of my daily upbringing. I am picking it back up where my great-grandparents left it off. Because the paternal side of my family, they were all farmers and homesteaders in Tennessee and Kentucky. And my grandmother's side of the family on my mom's side, the maternal side, farmed as well.
Closer to the speaker?
Can you hear me okay now?
No.
Okay. So what I was saying was farming is in my blood, but I didn't grow up on a farm, okay? It wasn't until 2009 that I actually put my hands in the soil with intention, and that was because my wife and I, who were courting each other at the time, thought it would be a good idea to have a garden. And so we got a small garden plot that was 10 foot by 15 feet, and she was at work one day, and I had some time, and I went to build the raised beds, and there was something that happened. Call it a miracle or whatever you want to say, but it was almost an instantaneous reaction to engaging with the soil. And come to find out that on a biological level, when you interact with healthy soil, there is bacteria in it that triggers a release in serotonin. And so for me, that was really important at the time, because
I think we just need the microphone closer to you.
Good
Yeah. There
Thank
you go.
There you
Yeah.
How many women does it take to do
What happened to
John
the lights?
has us all for us.
So we can.
I can yell.
Okay.
Um,
Got it.
So, and for me, that was really important at the time. That's really, wow.
It's fine, it's fine.
Oh, is it?
You're good.
Okay.
You're good.
It was really important for me to have that interaction at the time, because 2 years prior, I was just getting out of military service. When I had gotten out of high school, I enlisted in the Marine Corps, and within 6 months, found myself in Haiti in 2004, before the earthquake. And as an 18-year-old, patrolling the streets of Haiti, which is a very poor country, I was completely blown away. Shortly after returning home, we did a workup to Iraq, and in 2005, I went on my first deployment to Iraq, where we were surrounded by farm fields for the majority of the deployment. And I remember just being entirely amazed by these men and their families who would go out and they would interact with the landscape in this way that, even though we were there on a specific mission, and the mission, wasn't the best, I was able to find an appreciation for the food that was being grown and being produced there. And so that's something that I always kind of kept in the back of my mind, even as times got difficult. And after my second deployment to Iraq, had sustained a couple traumatic brain injuries, and post-traumatic stress increased just from my time being an infantryman, that it made it difficult to actually entirely reintegrate into what it would be seen as normal once returned home. And substance abuse was a very predominant part of how I coped with everything. And so it was on a chance that while meeting my wife, we decided to have a garden, and that was something that I felt was probably one of the most important things that we could have done together. And since then, our garden plots have grown in size each year. It doubled the following year, and then we purchased a place down in southern Vermont that had an acre of land, and then we wanted to move back up here and found a couple acres to work. And at that point, I had done a semester in college as a 26-year-old. We had 2 kids by that time, and we had begun working with college students. And so that was very much an integral part of the reintegration process, which not a lot of men or women who come out of combat or out of service have the opportunity to go through. Bless you. And so as I worked more with college students and veterans and community members, you saw the impact that ecological practices had on their lives, and how we all have trauma. There's no getting away from that. But our relationship to it is what needs to change. And I think that working with food and ecological systems in the natural environment is a really phenomenal way to do that. So not only are we becoming a little bit more human and find a greater sense of peace, but we're also growing food from this perspective that considers the impact of the work that we do, as well as the future of that site which we are stewarding at that moment. And I think that that's really what agroecology speaks to, is our relationship to the agricultural food system, into the living system that it is a part of, which we are inherently a part of as well. And so that's kind of what I want to share with you about today, is climate resilient food systems. And I put that part climate resilient because these systems, they're not anything new. If you look at the natural world, it does it by itself without human input all the time. And it's been doing that for 14.3 billion years. And we've been here for a couple million and think that we know what we're doing. And we have this model that's around us. And if we're willing to put aside our egos and labels that we give each other, and just kind of look and be and observe, there's a lot that is willing to be shared that we can apply to our food, and that is climate adaptive. So this is currently where we live, over in Bristol. This image was just taken a couple last Tuesday, actually. We had a couple of mid-students that have been helping out and interning, and it's funny because a lot of times students are like, hey, can I bring a friend? It's like, yeah, sure. So this friend, Mateo, he brought a drone, and he wanted to take images for one of his classes. And so we have about 10.5 acres, and this is probably about 85% of the land that we call ours. The upper part area is our upper pasture area. That's where we have our more intensified crops. That's where so this whole space is kind of breaking up into zones, and that's a permacultural influence, where you figure out what places you frequent the most, and you put those, you categorize them, and then kind of like based off of all the other principles, what you could be doing or should be doing or shouldn't be doing in that space. But the idea is to become more effective with your operation, and you can do that by becoming more efficient. And to become more efficient, you have to know what exists and what your relationship to that space is. So the upper pasture areas where we have more of our intense annual gardens, and that's these beds right here. And so they're smaller beds, and we've worked for the last 4 seasons to really build the soil within that space. And Molly touched on, the soil having great tilth. And what's really neat is that, we've turned over that soil a couple times with mechanized equipment, but for the most part, it's all been sweat equity and broad forks and wheelbarrows and shovels and a lot of biological material that went into helping to build that soil. Now, why does that matter? Because the more mechanized things that you put into a field, the more compaction that you're gonna have. The more you turn over that soil, the more CO2 is gonna be released into the atmosphere. The more you turn over the soil, the more you break apart the actual living part of the soil until the nutrients, they blow away, they wash away, they get baked by the sun. A raindrop falls at 25 miles an hour, which might not seem like a lot, but when you have trillions of raindrops falling and these really intense storms, that can do a substantial amount of damage, as we can see. Where we live, this is a big hill right here, this is the lower pasture area, and Notch Brook runs from south to north until it reaches the New Haven about a half mile away. We've been at this space for 4 years, and we've had some pretty serious rain. Never seen any flooding down there, okay? In a matter of 5 months, 2 weeks ago being the last one, we've had major flooding in that area to where the house that's over in the corner, which isn't on the photograph, was at risk of being, kind of really damaged. And the water came in, and it's happened twice, and we lost part of our road this last time. So in 5 months, we've had 2 substantial floods with rainstorms. And why is that? Because as the global temperature rises, it increases the water holding capacity within that space. So it might take longer for it to fill up, but when it comes down, it surely does, okay? So thinking about water holding capacity, when we farm in this way, and we'll get more into the actual systems itself, we increase the water holding capacity of the soil itself, okay? That tilth allows water to infiltrate, it allows roots to go at a greater depth. And that's important because it's holding on to nutrients, it's holding on to the integrity of the soil, which is what we want to be doing. And when you do that, you increase the nutrient density of the actual food itself. So what you're eating is actual food, not like the bagged carrots that have been sitting in plastic bags at Shaw's for however many weeks, okay? And that's kind of where a lot of this has come from, because we can look at the food that we're consuming, we can look at the physical ailments that we are being affected by, okay? And we can make a difference. We only have 10.5 acres, and probably only about 3.5 of that is in some kind of actual production for food. The rest is strictly for wildlife and for models. But we can raise a substantial amount of food on this small garden plot for not just our family, but for our community members. Diversification is key. Nothing in nature grows by itself or really in a straight line. And so we need to take that and apply that to our food system and consider how things can collaborate and work with each other. And understanding that, yes, times are changing, but we need to be adaptable to that. And so back in 2016, one of the first things that we did was marked out the hillside that we have on contour, which means the elevation lines. So if you look at a topographical map or any kind of map, you have those lines and they're either really far apart or really close together. That dictates the elevation, the slope, okay? And so by marking the contour lines, we are automatically increasing land degradation. By tilling only portions of that field, we're decreasing land degradation. But everything that goes into it afterwards increases biological diversity and biological activity. But it's got to be done right. You can really make mistakes with your landscape very quickly that'll take years, to recuperate from. But a little bit of book smarts and some really good classes and there's ways to do things strategically so that way you don't destroy things, okay? Now, we went ahead and turned the soil and we seeded a cover crop cocktail. In this instance, it was primarily buckwheat and clover. Buckwheat is a rapid, very vigorous growing plant. It's also really good pollinator forage as well later on in the season. Because it grows so well, if you cut it at a certain time, you can get a second growth. And so when we seeded clover with the buckwheat, what had happened is the buckwheat had grown really quickly. The clover had established itself, but it was kind of waiting for that light so it could photosynthesize and shoot back up. So then we're establishing a perennial crop with an annual crop. One fixes nitrogen, the other puts nutrients back into the soil really quickly. Both support pollinators, so it's kind of like a win-win. But at this moment, we began to transform the landscape in a way that would not only benefit us, but the wildlife that are a part of it. And this is a couple months later. You can see all the buckwheat that's come up. It looks like a hot mess, but that's okay, right? The other thing I want to note is that in between all of these lanes that we tilled, we planted trees. Bless you, okay? So the trees that we're planting, it wasn't just one type of tree. We put in trees first that would establish themselves very quickly, like black locust. In some states is considered an invasive species because of how quickly it grows and how much it suckers. But it's also very, has many, many functions, okay? So it's a rot-resistant wood. It has super high BTUs for wood burning stoves. If you do burn wood, it's great pollinator forage, it's great chicken forage, it's great goat fodder. It fixes nitrogen, it has all these things, and so we can put those in the places and manage them appropriately, either through coppice management practices, which is an agroforestry technique, or by just letting them go and cut them down at some point, and so on and so forth, okay? And underneath that understory, we planted a lot of elderberries, which grow very well in shady environments and moist conditions. But one of the biggest things that we did was start to inoculate the field with fungi. Okay, so there's a bunch of four classifications of mushroom. The ones that we were inoculating were saprophytic, wine cap mushrooms. So they're edible, but their main purpose is to break down biomass and set the stage for the next succession of mushrooms, which would be more beneficial, mycorrhizal or there's another one I forgot. I can't remember right now. That then develop these really healthy relationships with the root systems of vegetative plants and trees, okay? And we get to eat the mushrooms. And so this is, I think, either the first year or second year batch of trees that we put in. We have a whole bunch of trees that would gotten from Intervale Conservation Nursery, some stuff from Coldstream Farm, some stuff from St. Lawrence Nursery in Potsdam. And so we're looking for genetics of trees that are cold hardy, that are super resilient, they come from good parent stock, and that's what we're putting into the field. And a lot of stuff that we have and that we're growing, we can propagate from really easily. So we can take cuttings from the currants and the elderberries and just drop them in other places. We can take willow cuttings from the field as well and put those in places. And all those serve specific functions, and that's really what you need to be able to consider as well, is the functionality of a product. And so this image was taken last year. And so you can see the black locust trees here, which are now, at least as tall as this break up right beneath the window. But when we put them into the ground, they were only 18 inches tall. And so this is 3 seasons of growth, okay? And so when you have perennial systems, you're pulling out atmospheric carbon and you're putting it back into the soil where it needs to be. And so there is a purpose to having an invasive species, on our property. And you can kind of see some of the elderberries growing in the understory. But one of the really cool things about this is that we rotated chickens underneath. And so we rotated chickens underneath for a number of reasons, but one of them is we wanted to continue to build on the pasture, not only just from the trees that we're putting in. And so a lot of that hay, this section right here, that's a whole bunch of carbon that we put into the ground on contour to create a swale. And so what's going to happen is that's going to break down over time, slowly releasing nutrients back into the soil, building those fungal communities, which helps to slow, sink, and store water. And being on a slope, that's something that we really need to consider. But when we put the animals through there, they increase the biological activity more than just the trees themselves. So there has to be an integration of animals within these food systems. Now, we'll get in a couple slides, I'll show you our goats. Right now, we've been more focusing on goats for pasture management, but also for meat production. We have a lot of vegetarians and vegans who question food or animal welfare practices, and legitimately so. There's some really unfortunate CAFOs, confined agricultural feeding operations, around the country. The meat that a lot of people eat is not okay, and I wholeheartly believe in that. And we really need to consider, animal welfare when it comes time to this. My wife and my family and I, we eat mostly vegetarian, vegan stuff. But knowing that the goats that we were raising on here, when we go to process them here, 2 of them in the winter, that they had an entirely grass diet, that they were rotated paddocks every 3 to 7 days, depending on the size of the paddock, knowing that their conditions were phenomenal. I wish I was a goat, eating that pasture, because it's really incredible. And, the amount of love that they give, by me a lot, but then the people who come to visit the farm is really incredible. And so I see them as a tool, and during the grazing months, they work for us. During the winter, we work for them, and that's just kind of how it is. We have this really awesome relationship that we're building, and we're starting to breed now. And so this is another perspective. You can see, the grazing strips in the center of the tree lines. You can see this is our old chicken tractor over here. So this, I think, was from 2 years ago when we had the chickens in that space. But they just go through, and so we manage around the trees in a certain way. That's become more efficient. I don't like mowing. I do enjoy mowing, but it's really not the best thing to be doing for your pasture and for carbon emissions. So we've been able to actually get it down to where we're only mowing certain parts of our field about once every month to a month and a half, and the animals are doing the rest of the work for us.
Yeah.
And this is an image that was taken this year, and so you can see the black locusts have been thinned out, and all that waste went into those swales. The elderberries are doing really well. There's so much diversity within that pasture, and it's really incredible when you see the goats. When you see the goats that have been sitting on a space for a little while, and then they get really giddy and excited as soon as they see you start working the fence for the next area, and they go right to it. And they typically go to either the black locust or the honeysuckle first, which would both, honeysuckle is very invasive, and that's one of their favorite treats. And then they kind of go into the different pasture grasses. So making sure that they have a lot of diversity within the pasture is ideal, because their palate changes, and their nutrient demands change just like it does for us as well. And so it's been my dream for a while to actually start to have nut crops, but then to have a nursery in time. And so Buzz Ferber, who there's a picture of, he runs Perfect Circle Farm over in Berlin. He goes all over the place looking for genetics of certain types of trees. And this is a butterheart. So this is a cross between a butternut and a heart nut. So it has high fat, high protein, and it also has disease resistance to the butternut canker, which is really good. And once it's established, it grows super quick, okay? Which is good, and I think these trees bear nuts within 3 to 5 years, if I'm not mistaken, which is great. You don't have to wait for hickories or black walnuts, which can take up to 40 years. And so this is another example of what our pasture looks like and what we allow it to be. And so we have clovers, we have daisies, there's chicories, there's pasture grasses, there's a whole bunch of goodness in here. And we just let it do its thing. And the goats love it, and they'll clear that down, in a day or 2 days, depending on how big the paddock area is. And so this is a chestnut tree, a hybrid chestnut seedling that Buzz had gifted us with. And that's also what we're starting to introduce this past year. But you can see how many different types of grasses and the remnants of chicory, which is a nutrient accumulator. So it has this deep taproot that goes deep into the soil horizon, pulls up nutrients, brings it to the foliage, which then can be consumed by goats or sheep, or just fall to the ground and feed the soil biology. Yes, sir?
I'm sorry, I got here late. Did you plant all that, or did you just somehow let it come up? Did you seed it?
Yes, so we do intentional seeding.
Oh, sorry.
The 4 years ago, we had turned the strips and then seeded a bunch of cover crops, and we also do a lot of frost seeding, which means we go out in a thaw time, sometime during the winter, and we seed a whole bunch of clovers and rye and chicories and stuff like that that are just kind of gonna stay stored in the ice and snow, because they'll get covered again, germinate quickly, and then because of the weight and pressure, they'll have good seed to soil contact and germinate and establish. And we're also next year going to be starting to introduce that after goats, actually during goat grazing, but then also after as well. Because what happens is when, and I just learned this recently, which is really phenomenal, is that when it's really wet, different root systems are being stimulated for different plants. And so if you actually seed a certain type of cover crop or grass while goats are in there, they're actually doing the work for you and creating that seed to soil contact, but they're also stimulating other plants as well. And so we want to increase diversity in that pasture. And you're going to hear me talk about it to the point where you might get sick of me talking about diversity in pasture, but it's because of that allows us to do this and allows the landscape to regenerate very rapidly. And here they are. And so some of the lanes that they have are very narrow, but they're very, very long. And we have, we've worked very hard this season to be the most efficient with fence moving, and have gotten it down pretty good. And so a lot of times they'll usually have a little bit of space that's left over. Right now, those are two of our interns who are still working with us. They're both mid students, and we were teaching them how to move the fencing. Because it is an art, for sure, especially when you have goats. A lot of times, people are like, oh, you gotta have good fencing, you gotta have good fencing. And yeah, I agree to that, but I think that if you have good food for goats, that's probably a better thing than having good fencing, because they're gonna jump ship when they don't have the nutrients that they need. And so we're always providing that for them. And you can see that they're starting to work on the new space. And here's another picture, and you can see how tall the grass is. It's up to Emily and Caitlin's knees. And so they mow down the section and they go right in. And shortly after they go through a whole area, I will mow and knock everything down so that way we don't have to worry about the thistle and the other things that we don't want growing up. What's really cool about grazing, and Lee Reinhardt, who works for, I think, the Penn State, he works with NCAT, the National Center for Appropriate Technologies, as a grazing specialist. He was talking about the impact that grazing animals actually have. And so what happens is when, and I don't entirely remember the whole scientific process, so bear with me. But what happens is when the animals graze, they stimulate the roots, which then, kind of like trigger release in enzymes that you don't get when you mow the lawn. It's entirely different. So you might be cutting the grass to the same length, but the impact that it has on the biological community is either very beneficial or very detrimental. And that only comes with grazing animals. And so talking about the economics of this as well, a lot of the stuff that we have, and this goes back to wanting to have a nursery, is very easily propagatable. So we can take cuttings like these black currant cuttings that came off of plants that we put in the ground a couple, 3 seasons ago, and put them and root them out and then plant them out into the field. Okay, so we're creating medicine, we're creating food. We can contribute to our overall, pocketbook if we want to look at it that way. But a lot of these things are very easy to grow. Okay, and you can put them in other places even if you don't benefit from them. Songbirds will, and other animals will. Deer will benefit from them, okay? And so everything that we do, we always consider the impact that it has on the wildlife community. And because of that, we've watched biological diversity increase. Okay, we've watched songbirds, new songbirds come in and stay longer, and they're there earlier too. We still have monarchs floating around in our fields right now. And up until about 2 weeks ago, I was still finding monarch caterpillars on the last remnants of milkweed. And that's awesome. I feel great about that. We don't keep bees, but we have enough habitat for native pollinators to be in existence in our place, okay? So kind of shift, well, not, I guess. So a lot of these systems that I just described are more perennial systems. They take longer to establish, okay? And this is another example of that, but this is the integration of perennial and annual systems. So down in our lower pasture area, you see we have a big unheated greenhouse to the left. It's 30 feet by 60 feet. This is a very, very high wind area, and I did not recognize that when we first moved to the space, but the year before this, we had lost the plastic on the high tunnel 3 times because of the amount of wind that was coming through. And this whole area right here was originally just gonna be annual beds, and there's still part of me that wants annual beds so I can grow squash and beans and more of what we grow up top. But we use that as an opportunity. So in permaculture and ecological systems thinking, you're constantly keeping in mind small, slow solutions, okay? And so and seeing the problem as being an opportunity, okay? So because of that, it was essential that we needed to put in some type of windbreak. Now I could plant a hedge of like mulberries and hazelnuts and cedars and call it a day and know that it would be successful. But we took that as an opportunity to develop a 3,600 square foot forest garden food system. So taking the example that exists here, where we have the larger canopy trees, the middle canopy trees, and the smaller canopy trees, we're taking that example and we're pulling out the pines and the poplars, and we're putting in things like mulberries and chestnuts and elderberries in a very small consolidated space. Now what's gonna happen is from the top, this whole area right here, you can kind of see where a lot of the trees are. But what's gonna happen is the canopies, once they reach maturity, are gonna be at different heights and widths. So then we really create this wall of food and wildlife habitat, okay? And so this is a 3,600 square foot area. In 3 seasons alone, we added 32 tons of biomass, and we transformed about 10.5 inches of soil. And I'll show you a picture of that here in just a second. Okay, so this is from this season right here. We allow that grass to grow, and those grasses and the clovers and the buckwheats and things that are in there, we want to be there. This whole space is inoculated with mushrooms, so this goes back into Molly talking about the tilt of the soil, and being able to hold on to and store water and nutrients. And this space right here is a mix of perennials, blueberries, which are actually going to be put out into other spaces next year, and annuals, okay? And so here's a little monarch caterpillar doing its thing. This photo was taken probably about a month ago. And this is Ginger, loving on the grass. And so this photo was also taken about probably about a month and a half ago. For them to go through the whole upper loop, it takes them almost 2 months. And so that leaves sufficient rest time in the pasture itself, and that also decreases the parasite load. We did, one of our feisty, this goat in the back, she did contract mangenial worm, and that was, which is a crazy parasite. It's found in places where there's high deer activity, and with deer it passes through them. But with goats it gets lost and it goes to their brain and to their spinal column, and so they actually start to show neurological distress, and it can kill them very quickly. We were able to, like one night I was watching her and she was acting a little funky, and then the second day saw that she was really showing signs that something was wrong. And so we treated her, and she had to go through a 3-day deworming cycle, and I gave the rest of the goats 1 day. And so we can't process any of the goats for 6 months. You know, USDA says I believe 3 months, but we're waiting just because I want to make sure it's out of the system before we process. But the reason that I knew that was possibly going to happen is because the dew started to get a lot thicker and heavier, and so that brought in snails and slugs. And so that's when she contracted it, and I had a feeling it was going to happen there, and unfortunately it did. But she's doing, you know, she's back to her normal feisty self, no pun intended. Now, working annual beds, this is a method that has gotten a lot more headway in the last couple years. Jean-Martin Fortier out of Canada, he wrote a book called The Market Gardener. He started talking about plastic and broad forking, and a lot of people are adopting this practice because it's a way to kill off weed growth without having to turn the soil. And so the black plastic, yeah, you're supporting that industry, but it's not like it's getting turned into the soil like some of the more commercial farms that we have around here. where you have strips of plastic that are not gonna break down anytime soon. But we leave it on the beds for probably about a month and a half. We pull it off. The weeds have started to grow, but they couldn't photosynthesize, so they die back, and then we broad fork in order to aerate. So a broad fork is it's a very broad and long fork with tines on it, and what you're doing is you're kind of stabbing it into the ground, jumping on it, and you're pulling back, and so that allows you to aerate the soil, which allows for greater root depth and water infiltration while keeping the integrity of the horizon itself, and you're keeping the biology where it needs to be. When you turn soil with a rototiller or a bottom plow, you're shifting the biology, and so stuff that's supposed to be at like 12 to 15 inches deep is now at the topsoil layer, and that's not where it wants to be. Okay, and so when you do it this way, you maintain the integrity. And this was an image that was taken about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And the other thing about this too is, like, because of the scale of how small it is, we're able to make changes as needed. We talked earlier about the amount of water that fell in a short amount of time. Within 5 months, we had 2 major floods in our lower pasture area. But this whole season has been, the spring was super, super wet, and that affected even us. And so our beds originally ran lengthwise, and because of the amount of water that we had, we couldn't get in there. And it just, we could, but we didn't have equipment to get in there, but it just made it difficult. So what we did was we oriented the beds perpendicular to where they were, which then will allow that water to slow down and kind of incrementally sink into the soil before moving downhill, because there is a slight slope. And so the plan for next year is to actually build a more intentional swale on the east side right here, and then plant trees in it so we can kind of prevent that from happening sooner. And this is the end product. Our cabbage did absolutely incredible this year. Those are some aronia berries, which is a perennial crop. That was our sweet corn. That's what comes from all this. It's some wholesome food. And we have so much that a lot of times we try to figure out what to do with it. I don't really have a desire to do farmers markets. We do some sales to restaurants, and that's great and all, but I'd rather just give the food away, which is not a great economical model. But the other thing that these type of practices bring is the community. And I think that that's one of the biggest things about all this. We've worked with hundreds of students over the last few years, all types of groups. We've had like the Middlebury squash team, we've had the choir come out, we've had, we hosted with the Rural Chaplains Association a couple years ago, which was really incredible. But a lot of times people's perspective of agriculture is these large fields, these feeding operations, these barns and hay, and that's not the case. That's the last 100 years. And that's because the population increase was, raising rapidly, and people wanted to make money. But when we go back to more of our indigenous roots and how our ancestors used to farm and steward the land in that way, I think there's something there for people that helps them to build a better relationship with themselves and with the landscape. And that's really what we try to promote, okay? And so we have workshops, and this was, that's Buzz on the left with I love his Patagonia sweat, his purple fluffy thing. But he brought all these types of nuts, which was really incredible, and was sharing them with people so that they can grow these crops, okay? Like they say the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. Well, we can't really wait anymore. And so in the space that we've had, we've put almost 500 trees in the ground in about 4 seasons, and next year we're doing another 100 or so. And so every day, this is what I get to be grateful for. I get to appreciate this, and I can't not go through my day and not stop somewhere in my tracks and just look at where I am and what we've worked with. I don't want to say what we created, because we're not creating it. We're just working with the landscape to be able to build something that will last far beyond our lifetimes. And that's the other thing too, is a lot of the trees that we plant, I'm not going to see the benefit of them, but I know that my kids might. I know that the animals will, and that is what's really important to me. And so, going back to the comment earlier about raising kids in this type of climate, I think about that all the time. And let's just say I think about that all the time, and the impact that the decision is gonna have. And I'm incredibly grateful because our kids, they are very much a part of our workshop element, especially when we have students come. The students love the kids and the kids love the students. But what it does is, it teaches them to know where their food comes from. There's so many people that don't. There's so many people that live in food deserts that don't understand that, that product that they are consuming has no nutritional value at all, and it was processed in a plant with, and the embodied energy of that product is toxic, extremely toxic. But here, this was at our old place, and this is my oldest son, Forrest, when he was about 4 years old, and he just really wanted to help build a soil bed inside of a small hoop house that we built, for about $150, that was able to grow food and house chickens during the winter and provide mushrooms and, but then also the understanding of what it means to actually earn something. I think that too much of our culture expects things to happen right now, and they expect things to be expendable, and if it breaks, we can just replace it with more things. And there's corporations that are relying on that to continue to be the example that we embody. And it's really unfortunate, but here it's just like, they understand what it means when we cut down a tree. We talk about these things, and that's really important to me, but for them. And so this is our youngest. When he was a baby, he's 6 now and in the back. But, for them, and I don't want to be offensive in any way, but there are a lot of people who take offense to a lot of things. And rightfully so. There's some really toxic behavior and conversations happening. I don't blame them. But what we really do need to work on farming are resilient kids. And whether that's on the actual farm itself, or in the city, kids need to be hardy. They need to have a thick skin. They need to know what it means to not get what they want when they want it. And that's a really important piece of the puzzle, I think, because the reality is whatever burdens my generation doesn't fix from the problems that your generation created, which you inherited from the generation before that, they are gonna have to work through. And I think that when I see the kids, when I see the youth come and be a part of the farm, and I see our kids and how they react and how they want to be a part of this system, it's very humbling and it's very reassuring. And I know that my wife and I are doing something pretty decent. And here's my wife when we had bees and the barium, but you can see she was happy to have bees for the moment. And so this is another shot of the farm, but you can kind of see the slope that we're working with. You can kind of see the integration of perennials and annuals and wild space, and then our relationship to it. And then in the corner, you can see tents over here. I mean, we live in a yurt. We have 700 square feet of space that we've been in for four years, and we're building a house that's a net zero home built with materials that are, probably about 75 to 80% were raised, within, or grown within, 60 miles of where we live. But even then, I still just want to stay in a tent most of the time. There's something about having that relationship to the landscape, about being close to the earth. My family's in the back, but they know very damn well that I would rather just be in a tent most of the time, because that's where I feel most at peace. And be able to spend nights in the tents with them is really important. So we do what we can. It's not just about us. It's about everything else that exists around us. Okay, and I think that's what, to bring it back full circle, that's what makes agroecology work. We are a part of that living system. And when Molly was speaking, I was kind of thinking about pathways, because that's what my brain does. And I think ecological thinking allows us to consider the health and vitality of a living system. And with diversified agricultural practices, that allows for an increase in climate resilience. Because of this, we are considering the inputs and the outputs, and the increase in biodiversity and biological activity. Okay? Now, because of this, we restore a relationship with the landscape, we restore the relationship with ourselves and with our community. community members, because we are invested in the system at that point. If you spend that much time with a piece of land, if you spend that much time, you know, putting your body to labor and sweating, cursing at times, and throwing shovels or hammers or whatnot, there's a reason to it, because nothing is easy, and you have to understand that. And like, my body's hurting, and I don't want my kids' bodies to hurt, and I don't want anyone's bodies to hurt, but that's the price I think that we have to pay at times, is in order to have this be a part of who we are. But because of that, we are a part of that system. We are no separate from the natural world. We just have to acknowledge that, okay? And I'm very proud and I'm very grateful of what we are working with and the opportunities that we have, and even the struggle. There's a huge struggle with me at times, and with anyone who does this type of work. You know, we talked very briefly about farmer suicide. That's a real thing. And what's crazy is that in the States, farmer suicide is almost this, like a mirror reflection of veteran suicide. You know, and that's a really difficult thing to grasp. So what can we do? How can we improve the quality of our lives? And I think that, you know, if we have 10.5 acres, 1,000 acres, or just a 10-foot by 15-foot garden plot, we can make a difference. And I truly, firmly believe in that. And that's all I got for you. This is my contact. I'm John. WildRootsFarmVT@gmail.com. WildRootsFarmVermont.com is our website, and we are on Instagram at WildRootsFarmVermont. I don't know, Molly, if you wanted to do like a Q&A session, or?
Well, I think we have like 3 minutes until lunch.
Yeah, we just have a few minutes, but if anyone has a question for John or a question for me, feel free. Jump in. Yeah, a couple of questions here, Sylvia.
Well, John, I'm curious if you are involved at all with the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition and kind of spreading the word.
About the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, or about the work that we do?
About the work that you do.
Okay.
I mean, I'm wondering if there's, I know there's some, I don't, anyway, I'm just wondering, you know, if there's outreach to other aspects of the farm community.
Yes, so I had previously sat on boards for NOFA Vermont and the Addison County Farm Bureau. I was on the Agricultural Task Force for the Greater Middlebury Climate Economic Initiative for a little while. Molly and I actually put together a panel discussion 3 years ago about the usage of glyphosate, and that brought in a lot of key players within Addison County, but then also the state, to understand the impact of that. And so I do know Kirsten Workman and Cheryl Cesario, and have worked with them to various degrees on other projects in the past, but I am not a part of that coalition, but am familiar with the work that they do.
How about one more question? I saw a hand up back there.
I was just curious if either of you know, how do services or like new programs like, I don't know if you're familiar with Misfit Market, that like their whole messaging, it's basically a subscription box of organic produce that is unable to be sold because it's like too small or too big or too dirty or misshapen, and so the markets won't take it. And of course their whole like pitch is that this is really good for the small scale or local farmers because it allows them to sell produce they couldn't otherwise sell. I just didn't know if either of you had anything to say whether like that's true, or if it really is just like another cog in the system that's prohibiting people from buying direct from farmers.
There's been some contention about that, because some people say that the food that goes in those misfit boxes would eventually become compost, or they would sell it to processing plants. So it's not as if it's taking food that would be completely wasted otherwise. So that's one aspect of the controversy. But all things considered, to the extent that people are willing to take produce that doesn't meet those specifications of being bright red, and for an apple, bright red and perfectly round, you'll help to reduce waste, and also treat yourself to some new varieties of produce that don't meet those specifications that people in this country have become very used to.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of programs that allow that to happen. I think that should be the case. You know, I mean, nutrients are nutrients regardless as to what the shape of the product that they're coming from is. I like ugly produce personally, but I don't know of any initiatives specifically in Addison County that allow that to happen. I know there's cleaning projects all over the state, and Hope is a really big one. So is Salvation Farms with Teresa Snow, and she takes a lot of stuff that's not marketable and you know, donates it or puts it in other places where it's needed. That's about all I can speak to that, though.
I think we should probably close.
Yes.
But John and I will be around for a few minutes if anyone has another question. But I believe that the folks who've been preparing the dinner are downstairs waiting for you.